The Coalition for Peace Action, it's an organization to promote reflection and understanding, and especially, as the name says, action in a large range of different areas. And that's, I think it's worth emphasizing. From, you've heard about it today, but from nuclear arms control to negotiated international peace agreements, to state and federal gun safety legislation, to the processes and procedures of a functioning representative democracy. CFPA has done important work in all of those and other areas. It's a particular honor to be mentioned in the same name, in the same phrase as George Kennan. I'd like to take a somewhat historical view of the work of CFPA, not just the 3 decades of the coalition, but more generally where we are in our political experiment as an American nation, and how we've approached and retreated from and approached and retreated from peace. George Kennan, undeniably one of the most perceptive, even prescient observers of global politics in the 20th century, and who with his, well, I guess you'd say smooth yet erudite prose, became one of the most influential figures in global politics. Everyone commented, and I got to know him when shortly after I moved to Princeton, and saw what others saw, his powerful mind that contained one of the most detailed understandings of politics of nations and the history of countries in the world. He understood immediately that nuclear weapons had to be treated differently from other weapons. He helped design the Marshall Plan and the Berlin Airlift, and he understood that Tito was not a Soviet puppet. He understood that in foreign policy, intention is not the same thing as capability. We ought to keep that in mind when we consider the extent of the nuclear threat of Iran. We can learn a lot from Kennan today, almost a decade after his long and productive life ended. As Irene was going on, I thought she was going to read me a letter from George Kennan. I'd say, now that's really something. But if we are going to learn from our friend and admired figure, George Kennan, we have to be willing to examine and reappraise with clear eyes. Kennan is called a historian often. He certainly laced all of his policy papers with historical observations. And so I wanted to say a word about the historical approach. In the essay, The Use of History, Federal Judge Learned Hand said in 1953 that the use of history is to tell us what we are. Hand wrote in that essay that the founders of our country staked our fate on the proposition that there can be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And it's a proposition of which the truth was unproved then and is still. And by attention to history, we learn that truth is attainable only by trial and error, and a readiness to re-examine and reappraise in the absence of self-deception. So, according to Dr. James McHenry in 1787, this famous account when Benjamin Franklin was asked if this secret constitutional Congress had given us a republic or a monarchy, Franklin said, "A republic if you can keep it." Well, Frederick Schwartz, the former chief counsel of the Church Committee of the 1970s in the U.S. Senate, looking at damaging excesses in our intelligence community, he said in his more recent book, Unchecked and Unbalanced, that we Americans will preserve the form of government established, he hopes, or by fear or inadvertence, we will let it slip away. With an emphasis on fear. The main element, these are George Kennan's words, the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. That was his famous statement that came to be known as the Containment Doctrine, or even the Kennan Doctrine. This was seized on by many others, even more ardently than Kennan himself. And Kennan watched in some dismay, I think, as it was rephrased and even reconceived by Lippmann and Alsop and Nietzsche and others. Mostly, it became militarized. Now, Kennan was not one ever to think without complexity and nuance. Many who knew him and critiqued him often said he thought too much. But maybe he didn't think enough to understand how less powerful minds than his own would take this idea of containment and turn it into a simplistic military doctrine of military confrontation by every means short of nuclear war. Containment came to mean reactive confrontation, responding to each Soviet action that was perceived to be expansion. So rather than a policy based on a deep understanding of Soviet thinking and intentions, which is what Kennan meant, patient and restrained, it came to be global and relentless. The Cold War was a terribly damaging period in our country. Mostly, I think, even as powerful a thinker as Kennan did not understand the degree to which he ignited or at least fanned the flames of fear. Fear of communism that turned every activity into a war by other means. Diplomacy became war. Intelligence became war. Foreign assistance became war, whether it was humanitarian or economic. Fear is a powerful emotion. And not all of the problems with containment can be attributed to misinterpretation. Kennan himself spoke of political warfare. And he was pleased to use covert action to thwart communist election victories in countries without having a clear idea of what would result. He was eager to use foreign aid as more than a tool, but a weapon of the Cold War. And the Kennan Doctrine contributed to putting in place agencies and organizations and mindsets that even now, long after nothing remains of the Soviet Union and its communist propaganda, stoke a different kind of fear of terrorism, that would lead our government to spy on its own people, to engage in some atrocious behavior at home and abroad, that would lead us, for example, to lock up people indefinitely without cause, and without compunction to co-opt and use humanitarian vaccination public health programs as cover for international military manhunts. Fear is a powerful emotion. In fear, people can act against their own best interest, and it leads to pessimism and cynicism. We are now behaving as if, and this is because of fear, as if violations of international law are actually beneficial to Americans. You know, the fear that the USSR back in the Cold War would bury us, that they would stop at nothing to bring us down through infiltration and by weakening our institutions, has actually led us to corrupt our own systems. The thinking resulted in a huge array of weapons that had no technical justification. billions of dollars of nuclear weapons on hair trigger that remain still too much with us today, that might be used only because we have them, not because they have any military usefulness. This fear led us to embrace FBI infiltration of civil rights groups, to look for communist agitators. I.F. Stone wrote, the famous, very independent-minded journalist, said, "We find the head of the FBI treating sit-ins as a communist plot in a way which will only encourage racial paranoia." Stone, in his essay, "If We Acted in Selma as We Act in Saigon," wrote, reading the speeches of the racial bigots, Senators Eastland and Stennis, is like reading Rusk and McNamara about South Vietnam under Diem. In both, we see a picture of a happy land and a contented people torn apart by outside communist agitators. So, I believe it's impossible for the United States to truly live up to its professed values by practicing the kind of realpolitik that was practiced by us, our foreign policy leaders, during the Cold War and during the War on Terror. The kind of realpolitik that led us to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran, or support Pinochet and the South American juntas and repressive regimes across the Americas, all in the name of containing the Soviet threat. Our greatest foreign policy blunder has been our failure to live out the values of our Constitution in our dealings with other peoples. And to its credit, the Coalition for Peace Action has been an advocate for values-based foreign policy. The coalition sees no inconsistency in advocating gun safety locally and arms control internationally, military restraint in Asia, and order and social welfare in the streets and towns of our country. More than seeing no inconsistency, the Coalition for Peace Action sees that it is all of a piece, P-I-E-C-E. And you, they, we call for a recommitment to our principles, including the principled procedures and mechanisms of our democratic republic. There's never been a greater example of a grassroots movement having global impact, helping to reverse the nuclear arms race and advancing the cause of peaceful coexistence. CFPA has worked toward a world free of the fear of nuclear annihilation and a world that's more just and peaceful and livable for everyone. Your cause has been my cause. One of my greatest satisfactions has been your support of me, sometimes gently nudging me, but to reduce a bloated Pentagon budget and keep our nation out of unnecessary wars and to rein in the out-of-control surveillance state, to bring fairness to the criminal justice system, to end, I didn't mean the congressional justice system, to end the scourge of gun violence and so forth. The war in Afghanistan continues despite our best efforts to end it, but I know you are pushing to end it. The so-called global war on terror, what an odd phrase, has, made possible by the most expansive, radical executive war-making power in history, has been used to justify assassination by drones in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen, and actually has helped to fuel Al-Qaeda's recruiting. A global war on terror, derived from fear, right? The word terror is there. And it's interesting, it is a war on terror, which is a subconscious acknowledgement that this is fear that we're fighting. Not terrorism, not the war on terrorism, but the war on terror. Just a year ago, the public became aware of a great government domestic spying scandal in which the communication of every American has been swept up by the National Security Agency. Now, it's not the first. In 1975, the Church Committee said, our government has authorized, we citizens have authorized our government to act without oversight to improperly use intrusive techniques against American citizens who posed no criminal or national security threat to our country. Could have been written today. Well, there have been victories along the way. You've been part of them. We've avoided military action in Syria. That's a partial victory. And we're on our way to eliminating dangerous chemical weapons there. We've prevented the militarization at government expense, the crisis in Ukraine. And we are working still to bring under control the unconstitutional surveillance activities of our government. These victories, however, are fragile and tenuous, and that's why we still need the Coalition for Peace Action. Margaret and I were pleased to be active supporters of and participants in the Coalition for Peace Action long before I was in office. It's because it is so important what you do. The challenges are great, but just as the creation of this nation seemed improbable, just as we look back in history, we see time after time that by retreating to the standard, the high standard that is that are the values on which this country is based, we have gotten our policies back on track. A historical perspective helps us a great deal. I don't think that we will do it, however, without organizations like the Coalition to draw our attention to that standard. The work of perfecting our union thus remains an unfinished task. We are up to it as a nation, and I'm privileged to have been your partner in working to finish that job that Franklin and the others were talking about when they said, we have a republic if we can keep it. Thank you.
It's on, thank you. We only have maybe 5 or 10 minutes for some questions, so there'll be real questions if you have them, real ones, and not statements. Thank you. Rush has agreed. I know we are overdue, and he has to get going, so.
I've been very careful not to suggest that my decision not to seek another term is based in frustration or disappointment or anger, I won't be disingenuous and suggest that this is not a frustrating time in Washington for anyone who actually believes that through government we can help people. Because the House of Representatives is run by people who don't believe the government can or should try to help people because we'll just make a botch of it, they believe. And so there's a real frustration there. People ask me about the Tea Party. I think the Tea Party as an organization is fading, but it did stir up some long simmering but small ugliness in our country, and I expect that we will once again, sooner or later, uphold that standard that I was talking about and return to more compassionate view, a more compassionate view of government. Right now, it's not.
Rush, recently there was a bill in the House, I think it was called the Freedom Act, and you made some very good comments from the floor regarding probable cause. Since that bill is still alive and going on to the Senate, would you comment about your comments on the House floor?
Yeah, I can summarize it in fewer than 140 characters. Who would support a bill that doesn't set the standard of probable cause for spying on Americans? It doesn't set that standard. So even though it has been touted as reining in the NSA and stopping the NSA from wholesale collection on all Americans, the data can still be collected, and the NSA can still, and other agencies, can still look at this information about Americans. And remember, it used to be that there was a strong principle that our spying agencies did not operate in the United States, did not spy on Americans. But now this so-called reform legislation that's supposed to rein in the NSA allows these practices to continue, and the NSA can use the data without demonstrating to an independent judge that there is probable cause to treat Americans as worthy of suspicion.
Rush, first let me congratulate you on bringing to us a remarkable address, as bold a critique of the Cold War orthodoxy and as provocative as any, since perhaps Eisenhower's famous farewell, then he discovered it, on the military-industrial complex. Really a tour de force, and thank you for sharing it here first.
Thank you, Jeff. That means a lot coming from you, Jeff. We were saying at the table that I don't know anyone. We were both paying tribute today and mourning the death of Dick Ullman, and I said, without Dick around, I don't know anybody other. I don't know the next most broadest thinker on foreign policy issues is Jeff Laurenti. So that's.
You are a master flatterer, and I feel all puffed up like a toad. You referred in your remarks to the fearsome weapons that could still be used simply because we have them on the shelf and somebody could decide.
Well, by accident or deliberately.
Absolutely.
That's right.
And what's striking about the politics of what was the founding cause of this organization, nuclear weapons, is the growing, not diminishing attachment to them in the 25 years since the Cold War faded out. At least in one of our two big political parties. I mean, there was always a sliver in the Republican side that was passionately pro-nuke. But what is striking is that the last time you had a majority of Republican senators voting for nuclear arms reductions treaty was back in 1992 when George H.W. Bush proposed one. And since then, you've had nothing but stonewalling and resistance, and how hard it was to get a small minority of them to vote for a no-brainer like the New START treaty is really dismaying, and it's made it much harder to negotiate the next steps to nuclear rollback and elimination. Now, I don't know whether guys in the Congress cross party lines to talk privately among themselves, whether those friendships are any longer possible because of the polarization that Peter had referred to. But to the extent that you have some insight into what drives guys privately, is it, one, possibly a rational calculation that nukes provide a cost-effective way of assuring our national security better than something else that we still need them, or two, the campaign funding requirements on their side are driven in part by who's good on this from that industry's point of view and who isn't, or third, just the kind of sense that a bigger stick is always better than a smaller stick, and how can those of us who are not part of their political base constructively help in an evolution back to where the Republican Party in its finest days of the past 70 years used to be on these questions?
Well, there's a lot there, more than we can cover. I mean, generally, of course, this is the purview of the Senate rather than the House. And so when you ask how people are thinking, I'm at least a few hundred yards removed from knowing that. But I don't know how to explain it other than to think that it is a policy that grew out of fear, the reason for which has long since passed, and that gained an inertia of its own.
Rush, I rise to congratulate you as well. You've been my congressman for 14 years, even after redistricting meant I couldn't vote for you anymore. I want to go back to the Debbie.
You didn't like the other 2 years? Is that right?
I couldn't remember the other 2 years.
Okay, all right.
I want to go back to the Debbie Wasserman Schultz question about WWRD and change it a little bit, which is what will Rush do?
I'm hard at work, and that's why I took umbrage at the past tense in a couple of those letters. My staff and I are hard at work. Margaret will tell you she still doesn't see me a lot. So that continues, and as the Constitution specifies, the new Congress will take over on the 3rd of January. After that, I'm really wide open. I'm not using the word retire. And what I do is wide open.
One question here and then one over here.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank you, not just for your service, but outstanding service to the public over the years. The other thing is, I'd like to congratulate you on being the only Homo sapien to be more intelligent than Dr. Watson. Now, on a more serious note with Dr. Watson, experts in the field of artificial intelligence predict that within the next 20 years, about 45% of the jobs done by Homo sapiens will be taken over by artificial intelligence. By the end of the 21st century, artificial intelligence will grow exponentially. I can't do the math, I just have the idea. But we can imagine how many jobs will be left with super artificial intelligence. We'll have robotic soldiers, and we already have drones controlled by artificial intelligence. I'd like to know if you have any ideas how to slow down this progression, and what can maybe be done to stop it. And also, I believe the biggest threat of drones is not collateral damage. It's terrorization of the public.
Well, again, that's a big question, more than I have time to get into. I am one person who did manage to get an amendment passed in the House of Representatives in a bill that never went anywhere after that, to prevent the use of armed drones in the United States of America. When I introduced it, drones were still a relatively new idea that people weren't talking about much, and people said, well, why in the world would you need such a prohibition? And I said, just to be sure. Yeah, right. It's, obviously, referring back to the church committee again, we had a firm, well, not a complete, unfortunately, but a strong prohibition against assassinations. That's what we're conducting now, of course, are drone assassinations. It is, too open to error. So-called, collateral damage. I mean, that's a euphemism for you. Children and wedding party guests. It's too subject to error. It is too easy to do, not forgetting that some of these remote pilots also suffer a kind of traumatic psychological injury, but it is, I think it really has to be brought under control. And it certainly should not be carried out by intelligence agencies. I mean, if it is to be a weapon of war, it should be subject to the same control and command structure of war. And we don't have that now. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, with respect to Watson, the IBM computer, Watson has programmed into it a lot of knowledge about popular culture and such, but evidently it didn't, one of the categories that I swept, it didn't know anything about detergents. So I was able to answer questions about Tide and Cheer, and I knew about the Beatles would be the Fab Four, and that's how it worked.